All right, we're admitting everybody. And I'm going to share my screen again, and we should be up and going. Can you confirm for me, Nadine?
I see the first slide, and I see our 3 pictures.
Okay, good. All right, Nadine, I'm going to make you a co-host too, because once I share that screen, I can't see the waiting room.
Okay.
So you will also be a co-host, which means you can admit people. All right, you should be able to admit. I'm going to go ahead and admit and go back to sharing.
Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And while we wait to begin, please put the name of the community you're joining us from. Okay, North Pole, Nikiski. Hello, Linda. We're in Juneau, Fairbanks, Anchorage. I hear the sun shining. Well, this is great. This is going to be a great program. Just time to get out and amend our soil. I'm admitting more people right now. Should give us okay. Well, Patrick, it's just after 10. Should we begin?
Sorry, yes.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome. My name is Nadine Lefebvre. I'm an AARP volunteer in Juneau. On behalf of AARP, I'd like to welcome you to the 4th in our 5-part spring gardening webinar series. Today, our guest speaker is Leif Albertson from the Cooperative Extension Service, and we are excited for you to join us today. And so before we begin, I'd like to share a few technical tips for those who aren't experienced with Zoom. You have your mute, unmute button. So please put your microphone on mute. We can tell it's on mute if it has a red line through it. This will help from background noise while our speaker is presenting. The video is the next button. You can be on camera or turn your video off. If there's a red line through the button, you are off camera. If you could please turn off your video today to save bandwidth during the presentation. Participants, if you click this button, you'll see a list of everyone on this call. It would help for us if you could rename yourself if you aren't logged in with the name. You can do that by clicking the 3 little dots to the right of your name. And chat, everyone seems to be familiar with the chat. We're telling us where you're from. And reactions. So you can raise your hand to ask questions or applaud as you wish. We are recording the program and we'll be sending out the recording to all the links from the chat after the program. AARP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization for people over age 50. We have 38 million members nationally and 77,000 members in Alaska. Our mission is to empower people to choose how they live as they age. To optimize their power, we will help people to save for retirement, stay healthy and fit, including brain health, build strong relationships, and have meaningful activity. AARP is working on aging issues for Alaskans over the age of 50. We do this through advocacy, working on national issues like Social Security and Medicare and prescription drugs. At the state level, we are advocating for telehealth, a sustainable state budget, senior grant programs, and healthcare. Education on brain health, technology use, veteran services, gardening, fraud prevention, caregiving resources, and financial planning. And member engagement by hosting social groups, movies, guest lectures, exercise groups, and more events. And community action in Fairbanks, Anchorage, Juneau, and Ketchikan. Today in our gardening series is Soil Basics from Leif Albertson. He's from the Cooperative Extension Service, and he will share his secrets to great soil for gardening. Soil's crucial for plant growth, but soil science can feel intimidating for new gardeners. In this presentation on soil basics, Leif will break down some of the mystery and magic that is happening in the ground around us and share simple things gardeners can do to optimize plant growth. Leif Albertson's interests include public health, environmental health, gardening, nutrition, and residential energy issues. He is a statewide expert on several rural public health issues, including indoor air quality, food policy, specifically connections between community gardens and health, and water fluoridation. He also teaches food preservation and food safety and recently relocated from Bethel to Anchorage. Welcome, Leif.
All right, thanks. So if this is working right, you should be able to see a big blue screen that says soil, and my head should be in a little box. Does that, somebody give me a thumbs up if that's working?
Thumbs up,
Yes,
confirm.
sir.
All right. Excellent, excellent. All right, yeah, so that was a great introduction. I lived and worked in Bethel, Alaska for 20 years. Kids are from there. And I just recently moved back to Anchorage. So that's why the slide says Yukon-Kuskokwim District. I couldn't bring myself to pull that off of this presentation. I'm going to talk about soil today. I guess I'll back up and just say, if you haven't heard of the Cooperative Extension Service, it's part of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. It's the part that is most concerned with outreach. So this is what I do. I do non-credit teaching, outreach to community members. We answer questions about things in a lot of different areas. So one of the things that I do is I ran the community garden in Bethel for 20 years, and I worked around the region to help communities and individuals who wanted to garden get into gardening. Some of the feedback that I got about that was that it seems really complicated, right? And one of the things that seemed particularly challenging to people was soil. And I don't want that to be a barrier. I don't want that to prevent people from getting into gardening. And so that's kind of my angle. I'm not a soil scientist. I'm a gardener, right? That's my interest in getting people out there doing that. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. If you are a soil scientist, this presentation will be largely review for you, but I still hope that it's entertaining. All right. Slide 4. Great. Great. Yeah. So for starters, what is soil? Well, so one of the questions that comes up is what's the difference between dirt and soil? And not going to get into that big debate, but basically soil is all the stuff, right? It's all the great things we need to grow. And dirt is rocks. So in a general sense, that's a lot of times how people describe it, right? So the most basic thing that we think of at soil that we're growing is a mixture of weathered rock fragments. So it's little crushed up rocks. And that's what's going to give us the foundation for our soil. That's the inorganic portion of the soil that we grow in. So the other half of that is the the organic portion, the portion of the soil that is alive or used to be alive. Soil that we grow in is biologically active. It's amazing. It's magic. It's a whole universe down there of billions of bacteria and fungi, and there's nematodes and annelids and insects, and just an amazing interplay of all this different biology going on in this amazing ecosystem. That, I mean, it's like a whole universe. We also have pore space in there, air and water. So about 50% of soil that we plant in might actually be just air, right? There's nothing. It's a void space, and we need that too. So, what I think when you talk to somebody who's a soil scientist, they really get into this aspects, this details. It's really magic down there. And what we're going to be talking about today is that soil is magic. There's amazing stuff down there. It's infinitely detailed, but we don't need to be magicians to use it, right? So that's going to be kind of the thrust of what we're talking about. Soil has very diverse characteristics. We're going to be talking about some of those things today and what kind of things we need to know about to grow the things we want to grow plants, to be gardeners, basically. So a soil scientist might talk about texture and porosity, or soil horizons, or different types of soil structure, different types of specific regional biology, or different animals that live in the soil, like worms that would change that. pH, nutrients, things like this, right? And we're going to touch on a lot of these and hopefully demystify them a little bit. But just know there's a great deal of detail here. So when we talk about soil, I'm at the end of this presentation, you're all going to be very familiar with soil. It's going to take you 40 minutes to for an introduction, and a lifetime to master, right? People go on to get their PhDs in this. So why soil? Why do we need soil? What's the importance of soil? So I'm going to start by saying something really controversial. It's just like fingernails on a chalkboard for a lot of agronomists and soil scientists. And that's asked this question: what's the most important thing that soil does for our plants? What's the most important thing that we need soil for? And the controversial statement here, the answer to that question is the most important thing, the thing that we can't get around, is that it provides physical support so that our plants don't tip over, right? That's it, right? And so I talked about all these other things that it does, all these animals and all this life that's in the soil. But the main thing is the roots need to grab a hold of something, otherwise the plants will tip over and they'll die. And if that doesn't sound right to you, I just say, we can absolutely grow plants in sand, right? We can absolutely grow plants in marbles or in a gel substrate. Hydroponics doesn't require soil. So as long as we have something to hold the plant up, we can make this happen if we manage nutrients. Soil in the real world, in a garden or in a natural setting, provides nutrients, provides water as well. But I just throw that controversial statement out there to get people's attention, but also to think about, at the bare minimum, what do we really need from soil? We can grow in a lot of things. So don't get too wrapped around the axle on having good soil, right? When I talk to people about soil, usually I get a phone call and say, hey, we're interested in gardening. I'm not sure we have good soil in the community that I live. I don't think our soil is good here. And it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? And usually what I then say to people is, just right now, when you're on the phone, just look out your window right now. And when you look out there, what do you see? Do you see plants? Can you see any plants? It's like, well, yeah, I see some trees, and I see, I see my lawn. So, okay, congratulations. You've got soil that can support plant life. We're good. We can work with that. You're already most of the way there. And that's about as simple as it is. And so that's why when I'm working with people, I just really try to encourage them that the minimum that we need to have a garden to support plant life is the bar is pretty low. So beyond what we need to grow plants, soil does a lot of other things that we're not really going to talk about today. Soil is nature's primary recycler. There's a lot of biological activity going on there to break down things, to recycle nutrients back into new plants. As animals and plants die, they're broken down in the soil, and that's really important for the planet, really. And soil is not just little rocks, right? I talked about that, but there's two parts to it: the organic and the inorganic portion. So we're going to start by talking about the inorganic portion, and then we'll move on. So, like I said, at its simplest, we can think of soil as little rocks, little crushed up rocks. We get a little more detailed than that, and we put those different rocks in different sizes. And we talk about sand, silt, and clay. And so there's a diagram here that talks about the distance scale. All right, so these are very small. But the idea is that if you have different size particles, they fit together ways, creating airspace, water space, space for roots to move through, and animals to live, and bacteria, microbes, this sort of thing. These distinctions in size are arbitrary. We just said, okay, well, we're going to call anything that is over this size sand, and if it's a tiny bit smaller than that, it's silt. Right? But I think this picture here gives you a good idea of the diversity of size that you would see in a typical soil. And so when we talk about soil in a technical sense, we kind of use these terms: sand, silt, and clay. And we want different size particles to make good soil. This triangle here, this chart, is something that is in every soil book and class, everywhere, forever. You'll see it in every gardening book. And it has 3 axes looking at these different size particles and what percentage of these different size little rocks give soil different characteristics. So on one side, there's how much clay it is. Clay are the finest particles. Most people have a sense of what clay is. If you've done pottery or you've seen someone making bowls on a pottery wheel, clay sticks together. It's smooth. You can form it into ribbons, like in this picture. You can roll it into a snake and bend it, almost like Play-Doh. And that is kind of what clay looks like. Silt is just what it sounds like. If you've ever been to like a river delta, these are particles that are a bit bigger than clay. They stick together a little bit. They're relatively fine. And then on the other axis is sand. Sand is exactly what it sounds like. If you've been to the beach, that is sand. Sandbox, sand. Sand is sand. So soils are, their texture is defined by the what relative percentages of these 3 sized soil aggregates make them up. If you had just clay, for instance, that would be called a clay. If you got a little sand to it, it's still considered a clay. But kind of what we think about when we want what we'd call good soil, all 3 of these things, and that helps have room for water to flow, roots to grow, organic matter to exist, right? And so we want some blend of all 3 of these. Usually, if I had to pick, right, if we're being picky, what we like is kind of the bottom center here is this loam. That's what we sort of would think of as an equal blend of all these 3 things, is a loam. So if you are talking with gardeners and you want to sound like you know what you're talking about, loam is the word we use, right? Talk about how you're developing a good loam for your soil. I'm going to come back to this slide in a second, but here's another picture. Loam, when we combine these 3 things, sand, silt, and clay, provides a good base for everything else we want to do. Holds water well, it drains well, holds nutrients well, provides structure, holds organic matter, that sort of thing. So as promised, I'm going backwards here because I also want to just point out, like, well, what if I my loam has too much clay in it. What do I do? How much sand do I need to add? And I think it's worth mentioning this because the right answer might be none. If you were to take a road trip across our country and you drove, from Washington to Florida, you would drive across and you would see a lot of plants growing and a lot of different soils, and you would see a lot of agriculture, people growing plants on purpose in a lot of different soils. And just spoiler here is that it's not all perfectly the same blend of particles. People can grow in a lot of different things. And so if you have 100 acres and you're growing carrots, you're not going to be able to truck in sand, load after load of sand to change that soil composition. It wouldn't make sense for you commercially. Instead, what you would do is you would change your growing practice. So when I show this chart, I don't want you to so much think about it as how do I change what I'm working with, but also how do I change my growing practice to work with what I've got, right? And both of those are legitimate strategies for gardeners. If you have a small plot, bringing in sand to that to help it drain might make sense. If you have a large plot, it might not. We might have to change the way that we water or change the way that we till, change the way that we shape our beds to address drainage. So that is all to say that doesn't mean the soil is bad, right? Again, as we drive across the country, we see people growing in all different kinds of soil, and it might affect the way that we cultivate that land. Our techniques might change. We don't necessarily have to change the soil. So that was an overview of the inorganic parts of soil, right? And again, very simple. We can think of this as tiny bits of rock, right? And that's going to give the structure so that our plants don't tip over. Now, the part that is more complicated and I think much more interesting, part that people get excited about, is organic matter. In general, when we add organic matter to this substrate of little crushed up rocks, that's when good stuff happens. In general, adding organic matter is the best way to improve most soils most of the time. We really like it. There's some examples where that's not true. We, didn't have enough rocks or something like that. But for the most part, most soils, most of the time, people ask what to do. Adding organic matter is a great way to help build soil. This stabilizes the soil structure. You imagine we've got all these small particles and you don't want all the littlest ones falling to the bottom like they would in if you imagine a bag of cereal, right? What happens to all the little bits, or a bag of chips? They all go to the bottom, right? So organic matter is going to help stabilize the soil. Organic matter is going to act like a sponge to help hold water and nutrients in between crushed rock. And it's going to act like a glue to make everything stick together. Right? It's also going to act as a home for all of the living stuff. Organic matter. So if I'm saying, yeah, it's probably great to add organic matter to your soil. Usually more is better. What does that mean? What do we add, right? Commonly, so we can go to the store, we can buy stuff, right? So commonly peat, talk about peat moss, peat. That's great organic stuff. Where I lived in Bethel for years, right under the tundra, we had some great organic matter. Compost. A lot of people use that. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Cover crops or green manure. We don't see this as much in Alaska, just because we have a shorter growing season than most places. But that is also, you can grow something on the place where you're planning on planting your crops, and then just till it back into the soil. And then humus, decomposed plant animal matter. So this is similar to peat, something we would find under the first layer of soil if we went outside. So these are all things that would add organic matter to your soil and would help with your soil composition, help hold all those little bits of mineral soil, rock together. So can you just add anything that is or was alive? No, probably shouldn't, right? So there are a few things that, few ways you can go wrong, right? So if you're adding sawdust, that can suck nitrogen out of the soil. In general, what I tell people is if it kind of looks like dirt, you can add it to your dirt, right? Yeah, if it doesn't, then you kind of need to think twice. So something that was recently alive, branches, wood chips, straw, be a little cautious about adding that to your soil. Also, anything that used to be alive recently, weed seeds, right? We want to be careful about adding weed seeds to that. And that would actually include some types of manure. You can add weed seeds to your garden. Pathogens, some types of manure could add pathogens. You might not want that around food that you're growing. Sometimes wood can have paint or things that are treated on it. And so we want to keep that up too. So there's not a lot of ways you can go wrong, but there's a few things we need to be cautious about. Compost. Here's some pictures of compost. Compost can look different ways. Most people who are serious gardeners do compost. It fits in with gardening very well. I'm going to make the second controversial statement of my presentation today, and this is people want to argue with me about it. That's fine, but compost is not fertilizer. Compost is a soil amendment. So when we add compost to a soil, we're not doing it because it adds a lot of nutrients, a lot of food for our plants. We're doing it because it adds this great organic matter. Compost in general is a very weak fertilizer. And the reason for that is that compost, by definition, is something that has been broken down, right? It has already been broken down. When we break things down, those nutrients get drained away, they get taken up in other ways, they get eaten by bacteria. There's a lot that's going on there. So in general, we don't add compost because we're trying to fertilize our plants. We add compost because we're trying to add organic matter to amend our soil, to make our soil structure better. The other reason that people compost is as a way to recycle, to get rid of a lot of garden waste. Lots of ways to do compost. It's a good thing to do. On the left, I don't know if it's hard to see, that is sawdust and fish, right? So you got your nitrogen, you got your carbon. Goes a little beyond the scope of this presentation today, but compost can look a lot of different ways. It's a great thing to do, and it's a good thing to learn about. We can't do that instead of fertilizer, though. This is what peat looks like before it's harvested on the left and active harvesting on the right. And so this is a picture of the tundra in Alaska actually on the left. And if you peel off that first 6 inches, it looks a lot like it does at this peat bog where it's being harvested commercially on the right. So we have a lot of this, and there is not much, not really any nutrients to speak of in this, and it has been there for a very long time. So it's broken down about as much as it's going to in this cold environment. And so when we're adding it, we're not adding it because it will feed our plants. We're adding it because that organic matter holds our soil aggregate together, provides kind of a sponge material to hold nutrients in, and makes our gives a place for living things to live, basically. Cover crops. This is another way to add organic matter to soil. And again, not a way that we see too much in Alaska. More often it's in places that have a very long growing season or even a 12-month growing season. So in between the time that you would normally grow your crops that you want to cultivate, you would grow a cover crop on there, something that would get tilled back into the soil to add organic matter. Cover crops also prevent weeds from growing up while you're not using that field. Depending on the cover crop, it can also add some nitrogen if you're, if you're using a nitrogen fixing plant. But this is one strategy, and that you see a lot more in the lower 48, occasionally in Alaska, just not as much. So I mentioned compost not being an awesome fertilizer. So let's talk a little bit about fertilizer. This is another place when I talk to people about soil that seems very intimidating. It's very confusing. You know, there's some math involved, right? And I'm going to try to take that the simplest way I can, right? I'm not a soil scientist. I'm a community garden guy. My goal is to get people comfortable enough to, like, you know, actually plant some plants. So our goal with fertilizer is we want to put enough fertilizer on there. Fertilizer is food. It's what the plants eat, right? We want to put enough out there on the soil for the plants, but not too much so that we have excess accumulating in the soil and potentially running off. And the reason we don't want too much is because it can have some bad environmental effects. It can change waterways. It can change, you know, so if all of the nutrients run off, it can cause things like algal blooms, and that can affect fish and that sort of thing. It also, fertilizer costs money. It's either money or it's work, no matter where it's coming from. And so that is another reason that we don't want to use more than we need to. And a third reason that we don't want to use more fertilizer than we need to is that your crops aren't the only plants that enjoy fertilizer, right? So weeds will also grow much faster and more robustly in the presence of excess fertilizer. So if we can control what we need to what we add, everybody's better off. So skip to the right column a little bit there. When we're buying fertilizer, there's three numbers that are important. There's three things: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. These are the macronutrients. These are the main things that your plants eat, right? And so a lot of times you'll see NPK. The K is for potassium, obviously, right? So the chemical symbol for potassium is a K, and so that's where that comes from. But if you buy a bag of fertilizer, it will have three numbers on it, and that represents the amount of nitrogen, the amount of phosphorus, and the amount of potassium. And those are your three macronutrients, the three main things that plants need, the food that they eat. There's some other nutrients that plants need, micronutrients. We don't think about that much. Just the same way that human beings have micronutrients that we don't think about much. You know, did you get enough copper in your diet today, Leif? Well, I don't know. I don't think about that much, right? Kind of the same for plants. In some rare situations, we might be concerned about micronutrients, but most gardeners, most of the time, don't ever think about it. So we know that we need to add enough of this nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. We need to add enough fertilizer for our plants, but not add too much, right? We kind of want to hit the sweet spot. How do we know how to do that? Well, there's a couple of different ways, right? And one that you hear about a lot is soil testing. So we can actually look at the soil. We take the soil. There's a way to do that. We have a publication on it. That you take the soil, you dry the soil, you send the soil into a laboratory, and I got a little picture of a woman in a laboratory there, and they test the soil, and they look at how much nutrients are in it. They look at how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus is in it. They look at some other things too. They look at the composition of the soil. They look at the acidity of the soil, and they give you that information back. And they say, well, this is what you're working with. This is what you've got in the soil now. And if you know what you're going to plant in that soil, then if we use some math, we should be able to figure out what you need to add to the soil for optimum growing. And that's something that farmers do everywhere. This is very common practice, right? That makes sense. For gardeners, this may or may not be helpful. And the reason that it may or may not be helpful is it depends on what you're growing, where you're growing it, and if you're going to have that soil year after year. I work a lot with community gardens. So if somebody does a soil sample and then is in a different plot the year after that, doesn't tell them too much, because by the time they get the results from the soil sample, they don't have enough time to really change the soil that much by adding things to it. Soil samples, I'll show you a sample. I'll show you what a soil test report looks like. There's a lot of numbers, and we can help you figure that out at the Extension Service. We give help with soil samples and fertilizer recommendations with that, if that's something that you want to do. But the other reason that soil testing isn't always super helpful is that most gardeners aren't just growing one thing, they're growing a lot of things. So we're not really aiming at the perfect soil. We're aiming at soil that would fit a range of different plants that we would be growing under different conditions. And that range is a lot bigger than most people realize. So we can get very technical about having the perfect pH, the perfect amount of nutrients in our soil, the perfect texture of our soil, the perfect amount of water. But the range of what is acceptable is very big compared to what is perfect. And we're never going to find perfect if we're growing 20 different crops in our backyard, right? It's going to be a little bit different for every plant. So soil testing is an option, but it's not, I would say, not helpful for everybody and probably not necessary for most gardeners to get something done, right? If we use the information that is on the back of the seed packet and we use the information that is on the side of the fertilizer bag, we can get a lot done. We can make some pretty reasonable estimates that will make plants grow and will be successful. Fertilizer can look different ways to different people, right? These things are both fertilizer. And from a plant's perspective, plants don't really care that much where their food comes from, right? They're looking at that nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium as their main things. So whether you're fertilizing with fish, or which is a very old method, or you're fertilizing with something that you buy at the store that is going to have the information right on the side, plants will work with both of those. We need to know a little bit about them. So the fish on the right might take longer to break down and release its nutrients. We also, how does that compare? How much nitrogen is in that fish versus, a pound of fertilizer, that sort of thing. And some of that we can look up. Sometimes it doesn't matter because fish is what we have available, right? We're not going to bring, 50-pound bags of commercial produced fertilizer out to a fish camp on a plane or something like that, right? So using what you have available is perfectly acceptable. And we can help fine tune that a little bit. But it's fair to say, as a general statement, plants will need some fertilizer. We're going to have to add something. They'll grow better. And part of the reason for that is that if you think about the crops that we grow in our gardens, they're domestic, they're domesticated. And over tens or hundreds or thousands of years, they have been bred to grow very fast and big and produce things that we want to eat. And so part of that is that they have existed in an environment where we've cultivated them, where we've helped them by weeding, taking out the competition next to them, where we've helped them by giving them water, where we've helped them by giving them fertilizer. So they don't do well without it, right? We can't just throw a packet of broccoli seeds in the back, spread them on the lawn and hope that they're going to sprout out of the grass. They won't. They need some love. And part of that is feeding them a lot. They grow fast. So another thing that we would see if we did a soil sample and send it into a lab is pH. This is a measure of the acidity. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to sweet soil or sour soil. I don't know what, don't eat your soil. Don't taste it. I don't know what that's about, but soil acidity is also important. Some plants they're just their roots. They just do better in soil that is more or less acidic. Also, the availability of nutrients changes based on the acidity of the soil. So this is another place where a lot of people get wrapped around the axle. Oh my gosh, what do I do? This is going to work. This is too confusing. And again, I have to say the range of acceptable, very wide on this, right? For most gardeners, you're growing a few different things, right? You're growing a couple different things, and there's not one perfect answer for what the perfect soil pH is. If you were, a corporate farm and you were growing 200 acres of corn, there's probably a right answer because every single corn seed that you planted is genetically identical, and your profit is based on maximizing your yield, and so you're going to be very specific about that. But for most of us who are gardening, we're growing broccoli, and we're growing turnips, and we're growing lettuce, and we're growing berries, and we're growing spinach. So there's not going to be a perfect pH. And if there's not a perfect pH, we don't have to be as controlling about what our pH is. We don't have to be as worried about it. There are certain nutrients that aren't released as well at certain pHs. So that's on the extreme ends, why we need to keep our pH into some kind of neutral level. But for the most part, again, if things are growing, you're probably doing okay if plants are already growing there. Commonly, people will add lime to soil, and that's why, to adjust the pH. Soil can become too acid, and that brings the acidity down a little bit by adding lime, or the pH up, however you want to think about it. These changes, adding lime, changing soil pH, generally in Alaska, especially with our cold soils, takes a little time, right? Could take a year or 2 or 3, right, to do that. So these are mostly slow changes, and I have not had a garden failure strictly due to pH. So this is more something that over time we should learn about. We might optimize. We might do simple pH tests that you would buy at the garden store to give us kind of an idea of where our pH is going. But obsessing about our exact pH, probably not useful for most gardeners, and certainly shouldn't prevent anyone from trying to grow things. So it's kind of our home stretch here, sort of our summary. As long as we can get our pH in some reasonable range, it's around 6, that's fine. And we have soil particles, and we add organic matter to that, and we add some kind of food to it, we will be able to grow plants in that setting. That is a thing that we can reliably predict. And at the very basic level, that's kind of my goal, is to try to get people out there doing that. We don't need to overthink too much of this. And as you get into it, maybe, as your seasons progress, you'll want to learn more and more, and you want to optimize things. And why were my potatoes smaller this year than they were the previous year? And we can start to delve into some of these things. The Cooperative Extension Service has all kinds of information to help you do that. So publications, some of which I think we shared already. We have more online. We also have agricultural and horticultural specialists. There's also a lot of resources in Anchorage as you want to delve into those things. But this first step is basically to just concentrate on these few very basic things, get some plants growing, see what happens, right? I literally do this with children, right? So this is not complicated. You don't need a degree. You're going to add a little bit of water to this, and it's going to happen just like it says to on the side of the package. So that's me. And some that's hard to tell in the picture. It looks brown. It's red soil. I was in South Africa. I thought that was pretty neat. It's my contact information. And I mentioned that I would show an example of a soil test if you choose to do that. So mostly this is most useful for people who have large areas or are growing in the same area year after year, or are growing specific crops where it's very important that we really dial things in for what that specific plant type needs. So it looks like this. This is a lot of numbers, and tells you a lot of things, and it can be confusing. Here's hopefully you can see my little pointer there. These vertical columns are different soil samples that I just pulled from Bethel years ago, just as an example. It's going to tell you something about your pH down here, right? So, boy, some of this is, I can't remember what these are. One of them is probably this one is just a sample of peat right off the tundra, a little more acidic, versus our garden soil is probably somewhere 6 or 7, something like that. Can tell us the percentage of organic matter. Yep. So this one must be the peat. Yep. So it's highly organic, right? So it's going to give you a sense of that. And if you benefit from adding more organic matter to that, probably the answer is you would. Phosphorus, potassium, and then I think the next page is, yeah, nitrogen down here. So it's going to give you some idea of these macronutrients: phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, and then it's got some other nutrients there. So it's going to look like this. And what you do with this, if you weren't real familiar with it, is you would take this to soil expert. We have them at Extension, and they would look at these numbers and they would give you a recommendation. What would come out of this is like, okay, well, you need to buy a fertilizer has this much nitrogen in it, this much phosphorus in it, this much potassium in it, and you need to spread it at a rate of 1 pound per 100 square feet, something like that. That's the kind of recommendation that you would expect.
Leif, we do have a couple questions in the chat. I'm wondering if you would be okay if we pose those questions to you now.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I don't know if I'll have answers, but yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So one of the first ones was about soil replacement recommendations for a container for vegetables used year to year.
Okay, so let's see. This would be something like like a bucket on the porch, or like a some kind of vessel like that.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't replace them, I add to them, I guess, would be the answer to that. So over time, plants are going to take things out of the soil, and the soil is going to continue to break down. So the organic matter that was there is going to go away. The nutrients that were there are going to get sucked up in the plant. So if you've got house plants, if you've got plants on your porch, that sort of thing, what I do is just I add to them, and I do that different ways depending on a lot on what is available. So if I needed to, if I didn't have access to the store, then maybe I would add organic matter that I just dug straight off the tundra. Or maybe I would go to the store and buy a soil amendment in a big green and yellow bag and add that to it. And and I fertilize whenever I plant, basically. So if a new set of crops is going in that, you should give it some food. Yeah, make sure it drains. Yeah, so I use the same soil year after year, but with the understanding that you're taking stuff, when plants grow in it, you're taking stuff out of that soil.
Thank you, Leif. Another question was, should you add lime in before testing soil?
Oh man, so great question. No, you should not. So I will tell you my own cautionary example about lime. When we first started the community garden, started off with soil sampling, and the soil was acidic, kind of on the far end of acidic. And so the recommendation was to add a whole bunch of lime. I added a whole bunch of lime, and it took years for that lime to get the soil where it needed to be. It's very cold soil. And so you kind of need to think of that as kind of a multi-year process. I tried to catch up too much at once, and I ended up kind of rebounding the other way and then having soil that was too alkaline. So these are small changes over time. I would take the soil sample before I added lime, because you don't know what the results are going to be. And the lime that you add immediately before the soil sample is not going to change the pH quickly enough. It's going to take a lot of time for that to happen.
Gotcha.
And
Another question.
Can't take it out.
Oh yeah.
Take it out once you add it. All right. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. Another question was, could a cover crop or ground cover be used to surround veggies and control weeds, or would that steal nutrients?
Oh yeah. So it depends. It depends what you're doing. So there's different ways that people do that. So yes, absolutely, you can do that. Cover crops are going to take nutrients for sure, right? Because they're plants. But that is also a very old technique. So you kind of just have to build that into what you're doing. I think the bigger risk with a cover crop is that it outgrows your plants. So you got to make sure that it's something that isn't going to crowd out your plants the same way that weeds would. Certain plants add nutrients, right? Legumes fix nitrogen. So that can be good news. So yeah, that works fine in terms of like mulch. So sometimes people think about like, well, could I add wood chips to block out weeds? Yes, yes, you can. The trick is there's a difference between like mixing sawdust into your soil and having a layer of say shredded wood, mulch, shredded bark, something like that on top of your soil. Um, what you're kind of trying to avoid is if you really mix those undecomposed wood chips into your soil, they're going to start to break down and that can rob nitrogen. If it's sitting on top, you're going to have less interaction with the soil underneath it. And so a lot of people are successful with that. A lot of people also use plastic ground covers. That works great for keeping weeds down as well.
Thank you so much, Leif. Those are great answers. There's just a few more questions here that we'll try to run through real quick. So how helpful is adding Epsom salt to soil?
That's a new one to me. I would be real careful about that, I guess. So salinity in soil, boy. So I would talk to a real silent soil scientist first and make sure you have a soil test done, right? So Epsom salt's going to add um, some minerals, right? But how much of which one, I guess I'd be cautious about. Not prepared to give a recommendation, a blanket recommendation on that one.
Sure, sounds good. Is it true that you can't plant potatoes in the same soil from year to year?
I plant potatoes in the same soil every year. I've been doing so for 15 years.
Got it.
The same plot. Yeah. So we just every time you plant, so there's benefits to crop rotation for sure. That's a real thing, and that makes sense. But certainly, if you go to Idaho, they've been planting potatoes in the same soil every year for a couple hundred years. Anything you grow is going to change the soil some, right? Also, another benefit to crop rotation is that it can help kind of disrupt any pest problems or virus or bacteria issues sometimes by having a different crop there from year to year. So there's reasons that people do that, but I haven't had every year I have potatoes, right? So
Do worm castings add nutrients?
yeah. So right. So what do we like? We like the worm tea, right? We like the liquid from that comes out of the worm compost. That's the magic stuff that everybody likes. So worms are going to help break things down. It's going to be a way that we can compost things. And some of the nutrients is going to end up in the worms and some of it's going to go back in. So so yes, it's good stuff, but as a general statement, when people are curious about sort of organic fertilizers versus commercially produced industrial fertilizers, what I encourage them to do is kind of look at it a little bit, read it a little bit so that we understand the scale of the difference in the amount of fertilizer. So typically I could go to Home Depot, I can buy a bag of fertilizer, little granules, and that might give me numbers, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, NPK might be something like 16, 16, 16, right? And that's how many pounds of nitrogen per 100 pounds of fertilizer, right? So 16, 16, 16. If I'm looking to replace that with an organic fertilizer, either that I buy or that I make, this would be something like, fish meal or, bone meal or little flakes, something that comes in a cardboard box and a picture of the planet on it. The numbers for that are going to be so much lower. You might be 1, 1, 2 instead of 16, 16, 16, right? So just understanding that you're going to need a lot. And that, for the people that I work with, ends up a lot of times being a barrier because, if you live, because it's expensive. And if you live in a place where you don't have ready access to that and you actually have to buy organic fertilizer, you're going to need 10 times as much. And so that can be a challenge. So yes, worm castings are great. Vermicomposting is a great thing to do. We love it. But if the goal is to avoid using industrial fertilizer, you're going to need a ton of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Somebody else asked about the NPK numbers again, and I think you kind of responded to that already, Leif, and covered that a little bit. Somebody else asked about their garden, everything going great, but since 2020, it's been bad. Can't grow anything. Added lime with no luck. The only veggie is orca. I put horse manure last fall, so hope this season will be better. What am I doing wrong?
Oh man, that's not why I'm here today. So I think it would, I think so this is what one of my mentors says sometimes is like trying to give a haircut over the phone, right? So I don't know. I don't know what you're doing wrong. I don't know where you are. I don't know what the soil looks like. My best suggestion would be kind of probably using local resources. So do you have a neighbor that gardens? Do you have an extension agent where you are? And kind of trying to break that down. I don't know, what you're trying to grow, how much you're watering, these sorts of things. So, doing a soil sample isn't a bad place to start. Sometimes it's even simpler than that. If you can bring some soil to someone, right? So we have the experimental farm in the valley, and just kind of some basic questions might help. Horse manure, if you add it when it's fresh, it can be what we call a little bit hot. Sometimes we want that to break down a little bit so it's not too manure-y. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't, I'm not sure.
You've handled that very well. That was a tough one, Leif, for sure. Thank you for that. If you would go ahead and stop sharing your screen, we've got a couple slides and a poll that we'd like to pull up for everybody. And then our wonderful host, Nadine, will come back online. Thank you so much, Leif. And I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen real quick.
Hang on, we're getting there.
Whoa.
There we are.
So we want to hear from you. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you, Leif, for a wealth of information. I'm sure everybody will be in the garden this weekend. So, Patrick, if you could bring up our poll. It's a quick 2-question poll about our presentation today. So, did you learn something? I did. And how would you rate this? Great. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. You're ahead.
Right.
And if you have ideas about upcoming webinars, please, you're welcome to put that information in the chat as well. I think we're getting a very positive response. And if we didn't get to everyone's questions, I'm sure Leif has an email that he could share with us.
Oh, yeah,
And
on my slide there.
you could follow up with him, or as he said, if there's an extension service office closer to you, maybe you'd like to engage them as well. Okay.
If you want to share that screen one more time, Leif, that would be great with your contact info. I'm having a little technical difficulty.
All right, I should be able to get that out. Back one.
There we go.
Thank you for sharing that again. Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, once again, thank you so much, Leif. That was really, really great. I know I learned a great deal. We had one other person with a special question. So there is a small, very adorable apple tree that one of our attendees is planning to harden off and put in the ground this spring. Do you have any soil recommendations for a fruit tree like that?
Yeah, my recommendation is we have a guy that does that. That's my recommendation. I don't, not a lot of fruit trees in Bethel where I've spent the last 20 years. But
Oh,
we
yeah.
have, yep. So I would, get in touch with the folks at the farm, the ag folks at the farm in Bethel, because there's been a lot of work that has been done on fruit trees, and they might put you in touch with somebody in Fairbanks who is an expert on the topic.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. All right, folks. Well, we're at the top of the hour. We're going to go ahead and stop our recording, and just really grateful to everybody for joining us for this gardening series. Thank you to our presenter, Leif. Thank you to our wonderful host, Nadine, and to all of you for joining us from all over the state and in some cases outside the state. It's great to see everybody, and we hope you take this information and grow well.